Welcome to The Third Story. I'm your host, Leo Sidran. Happy New Year. I'm so happy to be here with you today and to be kicking off the year with this great episode, a conversation with the brilliant pianist, composer, educator, recording artist, and storyteller, Fred Hersch. Fred has been a major fixture on the jazz scene in New York and around the world for 45 years. As a matter of fact, he told me, I'm 63 years old, and I've been playing 2-5-1 for 45 years. He said, I don't know many people that can go to work after 45 years and say they're really looking forward to it. But he says, as long as I can keep my physical skills intact, I'm going to keep going until I can't go anymore. And while the same could really be true for all of us, in Fred's case, it is especially true because for 30 plus years, just staying alive has been a struggle for him sometimes, and that's because he's been living with HIV since then. Still, his creative output is exhaustive. He's always working on another project. And in Fred's case, the intersection of life and work has been constant. For example, about 10 years ago, he slipped into a coma for 2 months, and when he emerged after recuperating, getting his strength back, and really relearning how to play, he wrote and produced My Coma Dreams, a long-form song cycle presented with music, words, and video about the perceptions of the world that he had from within his coma. There was a documentary film called The Ballad of Fred Hersch that was made about that experience, and his memoir, Good Things Happen Slowly, was published in 2017. Among other things, in the book he talks about growing up in Cincinnati, moving to New York, living a kind of double life as a gay jazz musician before he eventually came out in the early 1990s and took control of his story, of his narrative. So needless to say, his life and his work have been well documented. And ostensibly what brought us together was the latest document, an album called Trio 97 at the Village Vanguard, which came out last month. And it's actually a live record that was recorded over 20 years ago on the occasion of his first tenure as a leader, as a band leader at the Village Vanguard in New York. He had played there since the late 70s as a sideman, but this was the first time he played there as a leader. And subsequently, he's made the Vanguard his home. He plays there often 3 times a year for an extended period, and he's recorded many records there. As a matter of fact, as I speak these words to you right now, he is in the midst of his January residency there. So the Vanguard is not an unusual location to find him. But this record was a bit special because it captured something from years ago, and with the benefit of hindsight, you could reflect on the way life and his art have evolved. But the truth is, we could have talked at any time because there's always a next project with Fred. Even as we discussed Trio 97, he was eager to tell me about yet another record he made at the Vanguard in October, a duo recording with Esperanza Spalding. And he was also excited to tell me about a recording project he has coming up in Germany with Vince Mendoza. The week we spoke, which was last month, his 2018 release, Fred Hersch Live in Europe, was nominated for a Grammy. That's his 13th nomination. We met on a crisp December afternoon in the Soho apartment that has been his home for 4 decades. As a matter of fact, at one point in the 80s, he had converted it into a recording studio, and it was a kind of a live workspace where he lived and also made records before he ultimately thought better of that decision. That's something I have yet to do, to think better of having your house also be your recording studio. But we talked about so much, It was a bit challenging and exciting for me to talk to him because he really has been a kind of a fountain of output. And he's also a really serious educator. He's influenced a lot of other musicians who I respect and admire. So going into a situation like that he has some very developed ideas about the work. But because he's such a sensitive person, it's really easy to talk to him about this area that I often kind of mine, which is that space where your personal experience and your personal point of view overlap with the work that you do. And he says some really beautiful things in the conversation. I mean, too many to mention here. You'll just hear them in a minute. But there's one thing that I really love that he said. He said, if I want to be the person I can be, I can't worry about what people think. I think that's the message to me. Before I play it for you, there are a couple of little housekeeping things to keep in mind. Number one, you know this already, third-story.com is the website where you can sign up, subscribe, listen to previous episodes. I've started posting related Spotify playlists that accompany the episodes. You can see those. on the website, and also there's some video information there. It's also a good place to go if you want to get involved on a deeper level and support the project. There's a link there to the Patreon site where you can support this ongoing exercise in deep diving conversations with members of the creative class. third-story.com. Oh, and one little thing. You know, it's funny. Fred and I had never really run into each other casually before meeting for the interview. However, a couple of nights before the scheduled interview, we did bump into each other at the Jazz Gallery in New York, where we were both going to hear Lage Lund perform. Incidentally, I did speak to Lage last year for the podcast as well. So my conversation with Fred starts out with a brief discussion about bumping into one another at the Jazz Gallery. All right, without further ado, here it is, my conversation with the great Fred Hersch. You're not really in the habit of going out to the Jazz Gallery.
That's the first time I've been to the new Jazz Gallery.
Yeah.
You know, of course, I know tons of people that play there, but it's just sort of not on my, who's at the Jazz Gallery? So I think I'll maybe join as a member. I mean, it's really easy for me. It's like 5 stops on the subway. It's right there. I mean, it's not like it's a big hassle.
Well, man, everything is really easy for you. I mean, you are kind of in the center of it all here, and you have been for a long time.
39 years. The same 4 walls.
This has been maybe one of the most constant things through your whole career has been this space.
Absolutely. I mean, thank God for rent stabilization. You know, I've just been able to stay here. And of course, when I moved to Soho in 1979, it was artists and interesting little shops, and Broadway itself, there was no retail at all. It was pizzeria and a lumber yard and a greasy spoon and a print shop and office furniture, and you know, now it's a multinational shopping destination. But the place is great. I'm in the back of the building. It's quiet. This was a recording studio in the 80s for about 5 years, so it's quiet. I can practice and rehearse here and nobody bugs me, and it's kind of a golden handcuff. I'm not sure if I would actually would have stayed here all these years if I would have had to bounce around to different apartments. And of course, being a pianist is not easy, finding a place where you can settle in with an instrument.
What was the room that we're in now? Was this the recording room?
This was the main room. That was the drum booth. That was the control room, and that was the vocal room.
Yeah.
When I started my studio in 1983, it was all analog, and when I quit in 88, it was MIDI.
Yeah.
In the beginnings of digital and drum machines, and it was a really kind of misplaced adventure. I thought, I'll engineer, I'll do my own records. I never learned how to do that. I just somehow realized I was not wired technically that way, and I ended up fetching coffee for a lot of maybe not so great piano players. The night I pulled the plug, I was playing at the Village Vanguard with Joe Henderson, and it seemed like every third person came up, "Hey Fred, how's the studio? How's the studio? How's the studio?" And I went out to Bradley's and had a few drinks and came home, and I turned on the control room big dimmer and looked at all the stuff, and I said, "That's it." Sold all my good microphones and got rid of everything and really never looked back. But you know, I learned about producing, I learned about sound, and I learned about microphone techniques, and you know, it wasn't a total loss. And I met some people that turned out to be really important to me in my career down the line. So just try not to look back.
Well, I get the sense that you are maybe from the last generation of jazz musicians for whom a recording career really had an impact on what happened to you, being signed to a label, the kinds of albums that you made. The business of recording was very present for a long part of your career.
Yeah, I mean, in contrast to younger musicians today, I was 30 before I made my first album as a leader. And of course, back then, you actually had to have a record company. You couldn't press them yourself. You couldn't distribute them yourself. You couldn't, you had to have somebody doing that for you. And then through my 30s, I did record, but I sort of was a little late for this young lion feeding frenzy, and I didn't really get a kind of major label deal till I was close to 40, with none such which was, certainly a major label, but not Blue Note or Verve or, ECM, like a jazz cachet kind of label.
Yep.
I've been lucky. I mean, I've been well documented. I continue to put out projects. I mean, I've got one coming out this week. I always seem to find ways to get things going. And of course, now we're all dealing with sort of the death of the physical thing. Records mean something different now. But I think people are always going to want to document their work, and they're going to want to put their work out there. And, so obviously there's no money to be made in it, but it does let people know in the booking sphere what you're up to, what your projects are, what your band sounds like. And there are fans out there who,
sure,
God love them, still buy them on the road, and I still like the physical thing.
Mm-hmm.
I stream, of course, but I also, if I hear of a record or maybe know a friend that's putting out an album, I mean, sometimes I'll buy it because I feel like somebody should buy it. Somebody should support it. I shouldn't just wait till it comes on Spotify.
Yeah. I like the way you describe making albums as a kind of documenting process, and it does sort of lead to the record that you alluded to that's coming out this week, because there's an album that you have coming out this week that is actually a document of a performance that's over 20 years old. Your first concert as a leader at the Vanguard.
Yeah, it's interesting. That band with Drew Gress and Tom Rainey was together a good 6-7 years. We made a couple records for the Chesky label, but we never made a live album. When I recorded that album, the album that's being released this week, which I'm calling Trio 97, we really just did it for posterity. The engineer I was working with at the time, he said, look, let's just record this, and it's a piece of history, and you're going to maybe look back at things. And my health was not as precarious as it got, but it was plenty precarious. As many times as I had played at the Vanguard as a sideman, there's something amazingly validating about doing that as a band leader. And so I was going through some CDs, and I found the 3 sets from that Friday night of that week in July of 97, and started thinking, well, maybe the Japanese that could be kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought, should I put it all out?
Mm-hmm.
And then the more I played with it, the more I just felt like I just want to just capture 8 performances into one album. There is a Japanese version, which will have one bonus track,
sure,
an exclusive. The interesting thing for me, I think, the last 8, maybe 9 albums I have made have been live albums, except one.
Mm-hmm.
And of those, at least half I didn't know were being recorded. So maybe I'm segueing into this thing of, at least for jazz music, that's where I feel I'm at my best.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not that good in the studio anymore. I get self-conscious. I try too hard. There's something about kind of just playing the gig and then somebody just hands it to you afterwards. Or in some cases, in the back of their mind, somebody said, oh yeah, we're recording that, but you didn't really think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think kind of discovering stuff is kind of where a little bit more where I'm at. The next project is going to be that I'm recording next month is totally different projects. It's with the WDR Big Band in Cologne. Vince Mendoza is arranging 11 of my compositions. I'm sure he's going to do an amazing job.
Yeah.
He's an artist, and I trust what he's going to come up with for the material. I mean, I'll know in advance, but he's not going to let me get in there and monkey around with it too much, I don't think. But I'm sure we'll be recording at least probably in a hall or in a big studio. It won't be like in a small New York studio where you're
like
really
this was.
Yeah, well, where you're dependent on headphones, and I imagine that the German recording process will be very deluxe.
Yes, you allude to how your health was when this trio record was made and recording was made at the Vanguard the first time you played there in '97, and it's known in the community you've been HIV positive for a long time. I think you were HIV positive when you recorded your first album as a leader.
I was, so it's been since about 85, maybe even earlier, but since there was actually a test.
Yeah.
So, the darkest days were the late 80s and early 90s, and it wasn't until 96, the year before this record, that what we call combination therapy, using different classes of drugs to neutralize the virus, became a thing. I was not, quote, successful on it. It did not reduce my virus to a undetectable situation. That didn't happen actually until 10 years ago, when I actually, ironically, got much sicker, dementia and a 2-month coma. But, certainly there was a feeling of urgency, and there was a feeling of just wanting to sort of be counted in that way. I think it meant a great deal to me. I had just signed with Nonesuch, but they weren't making with me. I was doing more. I did a Billy Strayhorn album and a Monk album and a Rodgers and Hammerstein album and more kind of songbooky things I was doing for them, which I enjoyed. But Bob Hurwitz was just not really into making jazz records.
Yeah.
In the standard way with a working band. That was just not something that he was that into. But discovering these tracks, I mean, the band sounds really sparkly. Drew Gress sounds just masterful. I mean, I've been very fortunate in the last maybe 20, 22 years. I've only played with 2 bass players. Drew Gress, first with Tom Rainey and then with Nasheet Waits, and then John Hebert with Nasheet Waits, and then with Eric McPherson. And that trio with Eric and John is celebrating its 10th anniversary this summer at the Vanguard. To play with 2 totally bass players for all these years has really, I tend to really lean on the bass. I tend to really be focused on the bass. A lot of young bassists are impressive in many, many ways, but to me the mark of great jazz musicians is the ability to make more out of less. To be able to take a fairly simple tune and reinvent it constantly. It's not about, complex, multi-rhythmic, ostinato-y, kind of groovy, patterny things. It's, I lean on a bass player in terms of, harmony and understanding how I phrase and just, of course, the rhythmic hookup and sound. Both Drew and John they just have beautiful sounds, and you always hear the wood. You never hear an amp. You never hear it doesn't sound pick-up-y. It sounds, like a bass. Yeah. So I tend to be very, very loyal.
Yes. In a lot of ways, the relationship that you have with your band is is a relationship. I mean, you say in your memoir, you say it's like every musical relationship is like a love affair.
And sometimes people grow and change, and the way that my trios have gone, kind of one person has stepped out, another person has stepped in, then another person has stepped out, it's sort of like a daisy chain leapfrog kind of situation. Yeah. And there've been relationships that I've had with musicians that were intense but of shorter duration. It's like, you date somebody for a year, but you don't get married. Yeah. Or you don't move in together. Yeah. John and Eric and I have moved in together. Yes. It's just, that's what it is. Yeah. And it's not just the musical sort of love affair. It's the trust that you place in each other. It's demands maturity. As you know, being on the road is a very difficult proposition some days, and early lobby calls and a couple of plane flights and no nap and a sound check and a gig, and then do it all over again and rinse and repeat. And you got to feel like, okay, for all of that, even though we're all tired and cranky, when the lights go up, we're going to really, we're going to give it everything we have. But also, there also, you realize, like in any relationship, there are going to be nights when just like the magic isn't there, and so you just, you have to have a kind of a, all right, well, we tried attitude and not get totally bummed out and feel like it's all over. And it can be almost comical. You all sort of look at each other. It's like, or, you get a piano that's just like, or the acoustics are terrible, or a totally dead crowd.
Yes. I had this experience just now while I was playing with my father in Europe. I had one night where I walked off stage and said to a friend who was in the room, that was just terrible. That felt terrible to me. And my friend said, it didn't sound terrible to me. I really liked it. And between the two of us, my opinion is more important than yours is. Meaning, the audience doesn't really care how you felt. The audience had their own experience with it.
Right. Many times I've gotten off the bandstand and felt like, man, I really laid it down.
Yeah.
That was really some great shit.
Yeah.
And you feel like people didn't really notice. And other times you'll get off the bandstand and feel like, it was kind of a B-flat set. It was nothing wrong with it, nothing special. Yeah. And people love it.
Yeah.
So you have to, first of all, learn to be gracious.
Yeah.
We can all, as artists, get inside our own head about how we feel about it.
Yeah.
But you're right, the audience needs to have their experience. And, maybe people will appreciate something differently in a small town somewhere than people might who go to the Vanguard all the time. Sometimes New York audiences can be very jaded and hard to impress. Sometimes you're in some little town and, the piano's a little wonky and the sound isn't great and you didn't play your best show, but you realize, maybe they have music like that comes through half a dozen times a year. And it makes them really happy and they're excited and they're not comparing it to what they heard, 2 nights ago at some other club.
It raises this question for me about New York in general, and what the music means to us here as opposed to another place. I came from the Midwest also. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin.
Right.
And, when I learned more about your story, about what Cincinnati represented to your development, and also just having a relationship with a smaller market and understanding both what the life of a jazz musician is, or a musician who would like to be a jazz musician is in a medium-sized city, and also what the relationship of that music is to the community. It's a very different relationship than it is in New York.
Right. Well, in Cincinnati, and this was the early 70s, so this was long before the institutionalization of jazz in any way. It was basically clubs. But even in a mid-sized city, there were 2 clubs that brought in national acts every week. I saw Teddy Wilson, I saw Sun Ra, I saw Bill Evans, I saw McCoy Tyner, I saw Shirley Scott, I saw Pharoah Sanders, I saw, for the price of a drink, or $5. The legends were still playing in the circuit clubs. They were still on the circuit. But the jazz community, one of the things that really attracted me to it was the sort of the socialization aspect of it. Not just the musicians who were all kind of, I think they got a kick out of a young guy who was really into learning how to play. This was before jazz in conservatories and stuff, and I was kind of a novelty, especially with the intensity with which I embraced wanting to do this. So the older musicians, they were around, they gave you a little tough love. You had to learn how to hang. You needed to learn how to ask questions and maybe to give an opinion now and then, but mostly you were there kind of a little bit more as a fly on the wall, and then gradually as you got to be sort of a little more established as a cat, then people would open up to you a little bit more. But also the people that went to the clubs. And I learned this later, of course, at Bradley's, which was the great social jazz hang of my life and of many people's lives, one of the great social jazz hangs. Just the local artists who would be at the bar, who were really interesting people, regulars, and the kind of the characters that came in and out of this. It was a scene.
Yeah.
And now there really isn't a scene, unfortunately, because this is my theory, and maybe you'll disagree, but as people drink less, cover charges have gone up a lot. And it used to be that there was a cover charge, but it was, it helped pay the band, but it was basically
booze.
It was booze. They made the money on drinks, and people really drank.
Yeah.
Now, because people don't drink so much, say for a young musician to come hear me at the Vanguard, I guess now it's up to $35 and a drink.
Yeah.
That's a commitment. And so it's getting to see whoever's around now that are, the established people on a regular basis becomes trickier if you're young. It's like you really have to think about it.
Yes.
Unless you go to Smalls and Mesro and you pay your $20 and you can go to both clubs. So that's where the young folks go. They do their $20 thing, but and they're hearing some great music certainly, but they're not getting the access to a certain level of performer sometimes.
And at the same time, young people are getting access to a level of education. I mean, they're paying for it, but they're getting access to a level of education, formalized education, that didn't, as you say, didn't exist when you were coming up in Cincinnati.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it never occurred to me to ask anybody for a jazz piano lesson. I don't know why.
Well, so this is something I think about, right? I mean, you had a lot of formal education. You studied classical piano. You played piano. But in terms of developing your voice as an improviser, it seems to me that it's something that you had to find on your own. Today, there is a huge mechanism in place. As a matter of fact, you were one of the early educators of a lot of improvising piano players. And yet we're lamenting the death of the scene. So it seems like it's a very different ecosystem than the one that you saw 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I'm kinder to myself, I say, well, look, maybe it was a really great kind of dumb luck thing that I grew up just trying to figure things out myself. Like it never occurred to me to transcribe a solo. It just didn't occur to me. I mean, if there was a tune that I wanted to learn, I couldn't find the lead sheet. I mean, I could do that.
Yeah.
But, it just didn't occur to me to do that. And, of course, transcription is such a huge part of jazz education now. There are these incredible, online services and Skype lessons, and I've seen the growth of a jazz education industry. The thing about that is, well, it's twofold. I mean, it's great that there's a lot of information. Now, having a lot of information is like having a big vocabulary, but maybe you don't know how to tell a story. Okay, so it's just information. That's, to me, it's still about, in the end, storytelling. Also, there's, I think, a little bit of a misplaced emphasis on, okay, you learn this, and this, put into a blender, and you are a jazz musician. And with the idea that kind of anybody can learn how to do this, that it's accessible. And honestly, I don't think that that's true. I mean, on the one level, it builds audiences. If somebody plays in a big band at university or is a music minor or even gets a music degree and then ends up, working in some other field, probably they're going to make sure that their kid plays an instrument, or they might support a local jazz organization.
Or just buy a ticket.
Yeah, but I mean, in the course of a year, and I've got my ear to the ground pretty well, at least here, and even in Europe. I mean, there's a lot of great talent, but how many like really break through? And also how tough it is now to figure out, how to make a living at this. I mean, you can spend $200,000 on a jazz performance degree and maybe not make that much money in the next 10 years at music, unless you are, you're lucky, and you start getting a lot of good sidemen work, and there are people, of course, who make a good living. But I find, and I think I find this more in Europe, but also here, there's what I call the real book jazz generation, and they learn, the kind of the jazz anthems, the 20, 30 songs that everybody plays out of the real book, the same songs. Sometimes they're even looking at the chord changes on their iPhones. They don't research the songs. They don't maybe even play them correctly. But they learn these jazz anthems, and they are in combos, and every year they have to learn, 20 new tunes, and so they graduate with their 80 tunes or whatever. And then they say, okay, I've done jazz, I've done the standard jazz, now I want to make my own music with my own band. That's a big leap. Composing music is really hard. And now we have Logic and Sibelius and music notation programs, and people can put notes on a page and it looks kind of impressive, but where's the story? Where does it stick? Is it fun to play?
Yeah, it's so interesting that you bring that up. I interviewed Lage earlier this year, and I asked him why he thinks everybody in our generation, he and I are the same age, writes. They all play original music. Everybody's playing original music. And he said, well, so many of my favorite innovators were writers. I mean, it's not just our generation, you can look back. But I think you make the point in your book that actually there were plenty of wonderful stylists and people who were influential who didn't write, or who found a way to put their own voice into great songs. And I think this thing about being fun to play makes sense. Are you enjoying playing this?
Right.
That's a question maybe people don't ask. Is it fun to play?
Right. Well, I guess when somebody like me, I grew up playing playing most of the time with no paper on the bandstand. At first, in my first 2 years, there was no music paper on the bandstand. There were no fake books that I knew of. You just had to kind of know the tunes.
You tell a story in the book about the saxophone player you played with in Cincinnati who would play the head and then stroll and say, now you figure it out.
Right. He'd just walk off the stage and go, okay, figure out the changes, And I can talk about philosophically the way that I write. I would say if you were to put me in a class of writer, and this is favorably comparing myself, I would put myself in a class of writer, maybe like a Kenny Wheeler or a John Taylor, or in my better moments, somebody like some of my other jazz heroes, where a tune, a song, it doesn't have a million elements. It has 2 or 3 things about it that are what I call features, that are distinctive, whether it's the way the harmony moves, or something, the way the melody is crafted, or the way that the melody and the harmony work together. I tend to write melodically, not always. I try to write some things that are light and humorous sometimes. But I believe in the value of tunes, and I used to kind of, for a while beat myself up, these days, every record I listen to has got a string quartet on it, or some very overarching, lots of very complicated sections and grooves and I think if it's a good tune, it should be memorable, distinctive, and it should be, not necessarily easy to play. One of my friends says, I really like your tunes. They're just slightly fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there should be a secret. There should be something that you have to live with and dig and try to find out, okay, what's the essence of this piece?
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that it has to be, you know, on the surface that complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, everything that Monk wrote fits in a book of 96 pages. And, you know, I mean, there are a bunch of blues heads, but, you know, 40 or 50 of them are really, they just create their own worlds. And you can play them 5 nights in a row and still find something really enjoying and stimulating about them. You know, the great tunes, whether it's, you know, I like playing Ornette's music for that reason. Besides the interpretive part too of what we were saying earlier, it's not any less creative to interpret a standard.
Mm-hmm.
To say, okay, everybody plays this tune this certain way. Okay, right, we know that. Okay, how could I play it or arrange it in a way that's different but doesn't destroy it?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I look at the words. Maybe that gives me a clue as to the mood or where I want to stretch something, or maybe even just adding a couple beats here or there, just to put. Toots Silvans used to say it very well. He used to say, just put a little signature on it. Just show somebody you thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
That you're not just like, okay, we're just going to play this tune.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I mean, I definitely feel like I'm a composer, and I've done big pieces. I've done Leaves of Grass. I've done My Coma Dreams. I've done large-scale pieces. But at heart, I'm a tune writer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to write good tunes.
Yes.
You know, and I just don't find that people are devoting themselves to the craft of writing tunes that you know, maybe fit on 2 pieces of paper and, you know, are not science projects. And you're right. I mean, you know, everybody under 40 is pretty much playing original music.
Yes.
I mean, with some exceptions, but
yes.
You know, it just seems to be kind of where it's going. And
I like this phrase, it's not a science project. You know, it's not theoretical. This kind of leads me to me, what is so present in your career and your life, which is that, I mean, I always grew up understanding that your life influences your music and your music influences your life. These are not theoretical, separate things, that the way we experience the world, the way we think about things, the things that move us, they come out in the music. And your life has been very present in your work. They're not separate from each other.
In some ways, the older I get, you know, I'm able to finally access the simplicity of play a phrase, really hear that phrase, you know, quickly, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Let it generate the next phrase, get into a flow, don't think about where you've been or necessarily where you're going, just be present. And I think that's, you know, that's the life lesson.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to pick my favorite jazz musician, it would be Sonny Rollins.
Why?
It's so emotionally available. It's deep. It can be funny. It's rhythmically masterful, beyond masterful. It's narrative. It tells stories. And it's unbelievably hip. Mm-hmm. There's like nothing hipper than Sonny Rollins to me. I mean, if I were to pick one jazz musician, and believe me, I could go on about all the great ones I love, but he seems to have just mastered that, you know. And I love that, you know, at the height of his career, he just took off and practiced on the bridge. And it's interesting that we're talking about this right now on this particular day in December here. about 6 weeks ago, I had hip replacement surgery. My last gig was at the Village Vanguard. I closed on my birthday, October 21st. I made a live duo album with Esperanza Spalding, just singing, not playing bass, and it was just hot. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, it was just inspired and just magnificent. And I think when it comes out, people are really gonna stand up. Then I stopped for 6 weeks. And as a musician, I don't usually stop dead for 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Have you been playing though? Have you been able to sit and play?
Well, that's the thing. I haven't really had any mojo to play, and just had a lot of self-doubt, like, okay, can I get back on the horse? And, of course you sit down and your chops are kind of crappy because you're not really playing. You get a little disgusted with yourself, and I'm not a really heavy practicer, so I've just got to figure out how to work my way back into shape. And I've had some other health complications having nothing to do with the surgery. The surgery went fine, but there's some other things that have just made me feel kind of crappy.
Mm-hmm.
And just sitting and talking with you and talking about what we're talking about, it's like, there is a simplicity that you can draw on.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell students this for years. One thing to avoid is thinking about what you're not playing. So just play what you play, and if I'm playing at the Village Vanguard, my chops are better on Sunday night there than they are on Tuesday night. You just get in a flow,
mm-hmm.
right? And it's hard to just will yourself into that in your living room.
Mm-hmm.
We as jazz musicians, we need the stimulation of other musicians. We need the adrenaline that comes from a performance situation. But to find that, just play to play phrase to phrase and be honest. When I wrote my memoir, it was a real kind of cathartic thing. I was really ready to do that, to just be honest, not just to my friends, but to be honest to people who don't even know me. The honesty in the music is a real goal.
Yes.
Jazz music, I think, is somehow a little bit in danger of backing itself into the same kind of corner that contemporary composition backed itself into when people were writing rather severe stuff, or stuff where you could pick it apart on paper, and somebody would write a piece and somebody in the theory department at Princeton would analyze it, and somebody in the theory department at Yale would analyze it, but nobody really wanted to hear it. And what you say about the audience for this young, this new, everybody doing their own music thing, we'll see. I mean, if it's jazz kids writing stuff for other jazz kids, which is kind of what I think it is, it's like, okay, that's fine, but I have to stick true to my course.
Yes.
And not think, oh, I should be doing that.
I think it is too. I think it's jazz kids for jazz kids in a lot of cases. As you say, it's a good point. If it helps to create the audience, that's not a bad thing. To have an informed audience is a nice thing, as long as they are able to enjoy music and not simply be analyzing it or trying to be hipper than anybody else in the room by understanding something.
Yeah, how many times have you gone to a gig and you hear somebody start to play something and you see all the young musicians like counting, okay, is this an 11? Is this a compound meter? Is this like, okay, where's one?
Yes.
I guess I should just kind of get a kick out of it,
You allude to something in the book, and you just said it now too, which is that if we're honest with ourselves, then we are more able to be honest musically, that they're not separate from one another. A year from now, when I think back on reading your book, that's probably going to be the single message that stays with me, is about allowing yourself to be honest, first with yourself, then maybe with the people around you. If you're not being honest about who you are, you have to be honest about who you are. You can't be expected to improvise honestly if you're not
Right. My whole thing about coming out in 93 about having HIV and being a gay jazz musician and all that, when it was very fraught with, possible negative consequences. It's like, if I want to be the person I can be, I can't be worried about what people think. I mean, you want to be a good person. Mm-hmm. You want, of course, we all want to be liked, but it's from that point, that 25 years ago or whatever that was, I think I was always very honest, but it just made me even more so.
Yeah.
And I'm always so happy after a concert if somebody, says that they were moved or that I made them happy or it made them think of something. Or I think there's a power to music that's just beyond notes and groove. You want to challenge an artist and you challenge an audience, but you also want to take them with you. Part of my style is people can basically hear what I'm doing. I don't think it's stupid. It's not stupid, but I've got to trust that audience is going to hear that phrase and then they're going to go with me on my little journey. And I don't know where that journey is going to take me, but I want to take them with me. I don't want to hit them over the head or impress them. I think the things that I love about jazz is that it's with people, of course, except playing solo, but it's basically with people and in front of people. That's what the music is about.
It's good communication.
It's communication, and not just with your bandmates, but it's knowing how to create an experience for an audience. When any of us, and you may be prone to this, and I think most artists are prone to this, the little jazz police can get in our ears and say, oh, we're not hip enough, or we don't have this enough, or our chops aren't blah, blah, blah. But, in the long run, I've been fortunate enough to have heard so many great legends and played with so many great legends, even on nights when they weren't playing very well, and which was even more revealing, to hear them kind of, okay, they're not really quite firing yet, and then just hear them just be patient, and then all of a sudden it's like, wow.
Joe Henderson, you talk about how he would really take his time through a few choruses to find something.
Incredible, but then once he got into the zone, it was just awesome. Or Tommy Flanagan is the other one. I never played with Tommy, but I would hear him on nights when, it was it's Tommy Flanagan, but he would just be patient about it. And he almost got you to root for him. It's like that human connection.
Yes.
And also getting to know the legends that I got to know, getting to know them as people. The first time I played with Joe with Ron Carter and Al Foster at the Vanguard. Okay, this is how old am I? 26 years old or something, white gay kid from Cincinnati, Ohio, playing at the most famous jazz club in the world with three of the greatest players in history. And, there was that momentary freak out, how did this possibly happen? And then there was also a moment, it's well, I must be meant to be here. I'm here for some reason. And they're just people. They happen to be really, really, really good at what they do. But they're just cats. And once the music starts, I'm 1/4 of that music. Whether I'm 20 years younger or nobody knows me.
Yes.
I have a place. And if I'm going to honor Joe's faith in me, I'm going to play the music that's there and be as alert and do the best that I can and try to take this inspiration from these amazing musicians and don't feel like I have to drive the bus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that expression to honor Joe's faith in you, I think, is a good one, and it also speaks to deferring to leadership. You trust his musical judgment, and his judgment hired you, so that means you have to trust yourself to a certain extent if he's trusted you. You know, so much of your narrative at that time was connected to not being out, being gay, or not knowing what people thought about it. And in the book, it's interesting, I don't hear any question about being white at that time. You played with a lot of black musicians at a time when there was a bit more racial division, from what I understand, in the scene.
I didn't really feel it.
Yeah.
You know, when I started playing jazz in Cincinnati, bands were integrated. People didn't care if you were green or if your father was a lawyer or, you know, what part of town you came from. Nobody seemed to really care. I went to a totally integrated public high school. Mm-hmm. I never experienced overt racial tension. Mm-hmm. I've played with white bands. I played with integrated bands. Mm-hmm. The African American musicians that I've played with, you know, I realize that there is obviously a lot in their experience that I cannot possibly understand, except maybe just a little bit of an inkling being discriminated against for being gay. I didn't really experience a whole lot of that.
As a gay man, you mean?
As a gay man, I didn't, you know, I came out early, at least to my friends, but I think the discrimination that I might have felt was more like an internalized homophobia. Mm-hmm. You know, feeling like I was somehow less than. Mm-hmm. That seemed to be maybe a little more close to the surface, you know, feeling like, oh, if people really knew, they would think less of me. So I have to kind of discriminate against myself. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine what some of my black friends have gone through. Mm-hmm. You know, being black in America is just it's not always terrible, but it's a definite thing.
Yeah.
You know, years ago, I mean, I used to be around musicians and they'd crack fag jokes and not knowing that I was gay. And then I learned to speak up.
Yeah. Once you were more public about it was probably much easier. In that period when you weren't able to be public about it was probably that fear of what would they think if they knew.
Yeah. I mean, recently I did something at a school, and it was it was more about my memoir, and it was more of a kind of a talk symposium thing, and I was asked a very direct question about, you know, jazz as black music.
Yes.
You know, I don't really feel that. I certainly am an avid student of jazz history, and I understand where it came from, but, you know, it belongs to all of us now. It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
For sure.
You mentioned this thing about Esperanza Spalding. In Nate Shinnan's book that he released this year, Playing Changes, there's a chapter that talks about Esperanza and about this lecture or conversation. Maybe it was at Winter Jazz last year. There was a panel about women in jazz.
Yeah, I saw a little clip of that on television.
And she says, so now I'm quoting Nate, quoting her from the book, but something like, she never felt fully able to get comfortable when she was playing with men because she was concerned that her openness creatively would be misconstrued. And so she started playing more with women because she felt more comfortable physically and emotionally to just be totally giving, you know, that kind of communion can be misconstrued. And that really struck me. You know, when I read that, I thought, boy, I never thought about that, what it would be like to be a woman jazz musician, because of course we all know what that's like to lock eyes with the other musician and to really be there, and it's love. And you alluded to that also in the book, right, with a slightly different twist on it, which is that you were concerned that you might be misconstrued also.
It's coming on. Yes, that's absolutely true. And when Esperanza and I played at the Vanguard, my default as a pianist is eyes closed. mean, I'll play a whole concert without opening my eyes. But somewhere in the first set, we just started this thing of like really looking at each other. And I found that I was actually able to look at her in a way that I'm not able to look at a man. Mm-hmm. With that kind of like really throwing the energy back and forth, like, you know, like a intense visual musical tennis match.
Yes.
You know, and it wasn't unnerving at all.
Yeah.
But I realized that I am self-conscious too. And I don't know whether it's the fact that I'm gay and she's straight, or I did see some of that. There was a piece on the NewsHour on that, on the, you know, it was during Winterfest.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've played for almost 40 years with Jane Ira Bloom.
Yes.
You know, and I feel kind of bad. I mean, in all of this talk about women in jazz, I mean, nobody is talking about Jane.
Yeah.
She founded her own record label. Mm-hmm. She has uncompromisingly played her own music, which I think is absolutely personal and unusual and deeply felt. She is a total pioneer. She never did the sideman thing. She's created a huge body of recorded work and projects. And just, you know, she's not career ambitious. Mm-hmm. You know, she just wants to keep doing her projects and playing with the people she loves to play. And she just has such integrity about it and has never, you know, whined about how unfair it is or anything. But she is a real pioneer in terms of taking of a woman playing a saxophone, not a piano, taking ownership of an instrument and of her artistry. I just feel bad that she's not, that nobody this last couple of years with all of this, she's not even in the conversation. And
but as it relates to you, your hookup with her was obviously musical, although maybe there's a part of that also that goes back to...
We're Jews of the same age, and, you know, we just musically related to each other.
Yeah.
You know, and I know that she's written some things with me in mind, and we still play together, you know, now and then.
Yeah.
In the end, you know, it's music made with people and in front of people. It doesn't really have a color or a gender. Instrumental music is maybe the most abstract art. You can listen to a piece if you don't know what the title of it is, and you can think, oh, that sounds like, you know, Birds in the Forest, and somebody might say, well, that sounds like Traffic on 6th Avenue. You know, if there's no program, it's just sound and feeling, and you know, it doesn't matter who is playing it. Really, I mean, we like stories, you know, knowing that Beethoven was totally crazy and deaf when he wrote his late music and never heard it except in his brain. I mean, it's an interesting story, but the bottom line is the music is absolutely awesome.
Right, but then take Whitman. You know, like Walt Whitman reached you on the page, but off the page also. I mean, both were true. Strayhorn, same thing. The songs speak for themselves. They're gorgeous. And the personal narrative, when you know it, does change the way you hear it.
Yes, it deepens it for sure. When I did Leaves of Grass, people said, oh, you know, if Fred did that, Whitman was gay. And it has nothing to do with that. You know, just the words are, you know, I mean, they make you cry.
Yeah.
They were just so powerful and timeless, and I felt that maybe I could use music to somehow amplify some of the sentiments that were there. You know, sometimes when you set poetry, it diminishes the words. We have a big Whitman anniversary this year. We have a big Beethoven anniversary this year.
Well, it sounds like your hip replacement was not a moment too soon then.
Yeah, I can joke about being hipper. Now I found out I have to do the second hip too, so I'm going to try to forestall that till August so I don't have to cancel my year. Yeah, that's one of those things, like, how do you define jazz? How do you define hip? You know, you just kind of you just kind of know it.
Yeah.
You go like, wow, okay, that's got a little extra Vance. It's got a little extra sparkle.
Yep.
You can't manufacture it.
Can you learn it?
I think you can learn to make hipper choices. Like sometimes, writing a tune or something, it's like, that's a nice shape of phrase, but maybe if I just adjust that one note, it's going to make it just a little bit hipper.
Yep.
Can
you teach it?
I think you can. You can say, okay, yeah, this is good, but maybe this is a little cooler. Or here's a principle, try working it out yourself. I mean, as a teacher, I'm not very information driven because I feel like there's a bazillion books and things out there that people can, resources they don't really need to. I'm not going to sit there and show them how to voice a whatever chord, but I try to teach like thinking about cooking. Instead of like giving people a recipe, give them the principle and maybe push them and we'll give them a couple examples, or let them try to find it for themselves, but try to open the door so that they can cook on their own instead of just following the rules or looking back at what so-and-so played in 1963 or, I don't think all the great jazz has been played yet. I mean, there are those in the jazz industry who are kind of selling that a little bit. But yeah, I think, principles and for me also piano sound. Probably if I have one distinct element is sound, and try to at least get pianists to think about, okay, what are they doing physically and how do they, because it's like an actor's voice. I mean, you have to find that sound, and like bad stage acting, people are screaming and you don't really hear it. Good stage acting, they seem like they're speaking absolutely naturally, but you know that there's tons of technique that goes into it. So sometimes you find when you have a better ear for sound, your music becomes less cluttered, so it's all, it's a holistic thing. I mean, look, I'm 63. I've been playing 2-5-1 for 45 years. I've never had a day job. So I don't know that many people that can go to work after 45 years and sit down and say, well, something different is going to happen tonight, and I'm kind of looking forward to this. I mean, most people at age 45 are long checked out of their jobs. So as long as I can keep my physical skills intact, I'm going to keep going until I can't go anymore.
Well, Fred, thank you for sharing some time and keeping it going with me today.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. Great, man. Thanks for the good questions and for checking out the book and all the other stuff.
There he was, Fred Hersch. What a beautiful conversation. What a beautiful guy. I'll be back shortly with another great conversation. In fact, next time, another great pianist, educator, thinker, writer, influencer, and beautiful cat, Kenny Werner. So we're on a roll here. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.